The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, welcome to the general training session for Single Table Dedupe that we've got scheduled for today. I appreciate everyone signing on. Before we get started, if everyone, let's say if you can see my screen and you can hear me okay, if you will locate your GoToWebinar panel and either raise your hand or shoot me a comment and just let me know that everything is working the way that it should, that would be great. All right, and I see hands up, so it looks like we are good to go. If at any time you have audio issues or anything, just let me know. Sometimes we get weird connection things with GoToMeeting, and then there's some things I can do to try to fix that. So don't hesitate to let me know that. All right, well, today we're going to start getting you introduced to the Single Table Dedupe module in DemandTools. So if you're looking at your Today page, which is what you see every time you log in, Single Table Dedupe is the first module under our cleansing group. And this is typically the place you'll start with any deduplication job. And with single table dedupe, the goal is to, compare accounts against accounts, contacts against contacts, and leads against leads, and also custom objects to get those objects kind of cleaned up in their entirety. Phase two, if you are working with leads, would then be to move on to the lead conversion module and find duplicates that might exist between the lead object and then the contact and account object. So today we're going to focus on single table dedupe. This module is divided into two trainings. So today we're going to focus on the fundamentals. We're going to look at some pre-built scenarios that you have available to you and kind of talk about how to strategize and manipulate these scenarios to work the most efficiently with your individual data sets, and then kind of talk about the merge process too. So just know there is an advanced class, which is not necessarily advanced in concepts, but just really additional ways that you can use the tool. So don't let that word advanced scare you there. The training that we have today is also available on demand on our forum. So if you go to crmfusion.com, you can find it there if you need to listen again or if something comes up today during the middle of this. And then also, we're going to cover a lot of ground in the next hour, and I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. Everything we're going to talk about today is noted in our help documentation for this module. Okay, so I'm going to show you where that is now. There'll be a few points where I'm covering more vocabulary-based topics, so I might shoot you guys some links in the chat window so you can bookmark those or follow along that way. But to get to the help docs, the easiest way, just to the left of the module name, you'll see a green question mark. Just click on that, and it'll pop you to the help docs for the module that you're working with, okay? So don't feel like you have to write down every word that comes out of my mouth. It's all here. The overview gives you step-by-step instructions, and then everything else is kind of broken out based on topics. All right, and with that, we're going to dive in. Any questions, feel free, again, use that questions box and let me know what's on your mind, and I'll answer anything that comes up. Okay, so we're going to dive into the single table dedupe module, which just a high-level overview, looking for duplicates in the selected object that you're working with. And you do have a really high level of control over how this module works. Now, before we kind of dig into the details, let's talk a little bit about best practices and kind of how you're going to execute this deduplication job that you're about to start on. First of all, order of operations here. So in most cases, we recommend that you start with accounts. Okay, get your account object cleaned up, then move on to contacts and then leads. And then any non-standard or custom objects that you may have. Okay, so if you clean up accounts first, it's really going to help when you move to the next step of deduping contacts, because that's one less thing you'll have to think about. All right, so that's an important piece of this. The second piece of this, which is very, very important, is this thought process or this recommendation that we have that you're going to typically run multiple passes or multiple scenarios on each object as you're working through this in order to get kind of the cleanest object or database possible. And if I drill in now, and if I look at my first screen here, before we kind of dig into and load things up, if you look at this list of pre-built scenarios here, and you guys have access to these now, so these ship with the tool, but we've drilled into the account object here, and you see I have 4 scenarios based on my account billing information. One is labeled rigid, semi-rigid, loose, very loose. That represents this 4-pass or 4-scenario strategy on the account object. And within this strategy, you're typically going to start with your most rigid set of criteria. Okay, and rigid in this sense, and this is the scenario we will load up first, but rigid is going to be you're matching on the most fields using stricter mapping types, and it really is going to give you a high level of confidence that the records returned are really duplicates. Okay, so that's going to clean up that low-hanging fruit, those really obvious dupes. And then once you get those out of the way, then you'll start to gradually loosen things up. Okay, switch things up, match on different fields, use different mapping types. And we have some recommendations for how to loosen things up in these other scenarios. But a lot about what we're going to talk about today is going to be how to really thoughtfully manipulate these scenarios in ways that's going to help, again, with your individual data set. Okay, because everybody's data is different. So what works for one person might not work for another. So I really want to give you the skills and the knowledge to be able to adjust these scenarios to make them work the best for you. All right, so that's the second best practice. Multi-pass strategy, multiple scenarios is going to give you the cleanest object possible. All right, so now let's get started with our actual scenario. So single table dedupe, we're going to walk through 3 different steps here in setting up this quote unquote scenario. For the purposes of this training, we're going to start with this rigid pre-built scenario. And to load this up, I'm just going to double click here, and then we'll see some things populate across the screen, and that tells me that this scenario has been loaded. When I've highlighted a scenario here, just to the right of that, let me get my little pointer so you guys can see where I am. We do get an overview or a definition, so to speak, of what this particular scenario entails. So for this account billing rigid scenario, the fields that it's matching on, okay, or the data, the fields that have to be the same in order for records to be seen as duplicates are account name, billing street, billing city, zip code, and phone. Now, this is just an overview. In step 2, in our next screen, we're going to have visibility of these actual mapping conditions, and we'll be able to make changes to this criteria if we want to. So maybe we like everything about the scenario, but we don't want to match on account phone. We can remove that piece from the criteria, even on these pre-built scenarios, okay? So we get an overview here, and just know that anything we see in this, we can change. Okay, moving on further to the right, you see another list of fields here. This list of fields, when we get to step 3, will be the column headers of our results grid. Okay, and we're going to get there pretty quickly in this training. So we'll be able to see these column headers and how this kind of translates into a group of duplicate records here pretty quickly. But again, these are just our column headers. This list of fields doesn't have any impact on the duplicates that are returned. Okay, when we are selecting fields that we might want to see in our grid, we're thinking about things like, okay, what fields are going to help me determine if the duplicates returned are truly duplicates? All right, and a lot of times that's going to match the fields that we're matching on here, or be the same. There'll be some overlap there. But then we're also going to be choosing fields when we get to the point where we need to decide which record's going to survive, okay, which record's going to be the master. We might need to see some additional fields to help us make that decision. So if we need to add to this list, in my org, we like to see account source. That comes into play when we're determining which record is the master. So I can just scroll up here and click account source. And now that'll add to my list and I'll see that in my grid. I can also add more fields once I get into my grid as well. So I'm not locked in here if I forget to add something. If there's a field I don't want to see in my grid, I can come here. Let's say I don't want to see owner name. I can highlight that row and hit delete on my keyboard, and it will be removed from my list. I could also go and find my box here and uncheck it. Either way, either of those options will work. I'll go ahead and add owner name back so we can see it. Owner last name, that'll be good enough. Okay, so that's just basic scenario selection and kind of getting some things set up for our results grid. Now, the bottom half of this screen, you have the ability down here to segment your data. So by default, all of your pre-built scenarios are made to look at or created to look at all of the records in a particular object. Okay, and we know that by looking at this use all radio button down towards the bottom right hand corner of this screen. Okay, looking at all accounts in this place, in this case. If you needed to segment, maybe you didn't want to look at everything for some reason, then you're going to toggle to use conditions and write conditions out to tell it specifically what accounts you do want it to dedupe. All right, and for the purpose of our training today, we are going to use conditions and segment down. So I'm going to come over here, toggle to use conditions, and then write my condition out. Now, in this case, we're going to do just a really simple geographic segmentation and only look at records in North Carolina. So I just want to dedupe my accounts in the state of North Carolina. So my condition is going to look like this. Billing state. Okay, operator equals. You do have different operators depending on the field type that you've selected, so you've got some flexibility there. And then in my value box, I'm just going to write out the word North Carolina. And in this particular Salesforce instance, my states are not standardized. So I may have states that have a 2-character abbreviation, and I want to make sure I pull all of those down. So my separator to make sure I do that is going to be a comma, no space, and then my additional value there. So now when I add that condition, I've told it to just look at records that have a billing state of North Carolina or NC. Okay, and that's really all there is in a basic scenario in step 1. Now, you'll see some additional tabs here, and all of this is covered in the advanced training, but you have the ability to build a results grid using the bulk API. You also have the ability to read in a list of predefined duplicates, okay, of IDs of duplicates that you know are in your org. And then if you're a DupBlocker user, you can pull down already identified duplicates from your report duplicate scenarios in DupBlocker as well. So just know that these options are there, and if you need more information on that, that advanced training is the place to go. So it really gets into the detail of those. Okay. So now we're going to move into step 2 and see how this list of criteria that we talked about here translates into what we call our mapping conditions. Okay, so now we see from those 5 fields that our overview told us we were matching on, we see a row here, and each of these individual rows is called a mapping condition. Now, how this screen works is when you have records that have data populated in these 5 fields, and that data matches based on the mapping type that you have applied over here, then those records will end up in your results grid. Okay, so you're really only making 2 decisions here. Fields that you want to match on, and then mapping type and how you want that data to be matched together. Now, mapping type, that's one of those things that might be a new term to you. Okay, and mapping types is just how DemandTools is able to see values that are not exactly the same as matching values, despite some variations that might be there. So we're going to go into our results grid now and just kind of see quickly how this translates into a grid. And then we're going to come back to step 2 and really go through our options here with a fine-tooth comb so you can kind of know everything that you have access to and how to make strategic changes here that will greatly impact your results grid. One other thing I want to do is I want to give you a document that gives the definitions of all the mapping types that you have access to. That's something you might want to review down the road, even though we are going to talk about these as well. So I'm just going to go to my help docs here, and I'm going to grab this URL and just pop it in the chat window here. Okay? Okay, so we're matching now on account name, billing street, billing city, zip, and phone. And the mapping types we have applied are cleaned account name, street address match. We're doing an exact match on our billing city. We don't have a mapping type that would be good for that option. A zip 5 and 9, and a numeric match. So let's go now and just take a look at our grid, and then we'll be able to kind of see some of these mapping types in action. So I'm going to go ahead into step 3, and don't be nervous to do that. If you're just curious kind of what your results will look like for a particular scenario, go ahead and get into your grid and kind of see what it returns. That's a really good way to determine where your starting point's going to be. A lot of people get really nervous to come into their results grid for the fear that they're going to accidentally merge their entire grid, and it's just very hard to do that. So just by coming into this grid here, if I accidentally clicked this merge checked records without doing anything else, it's going to tell me there's nothing to merge. I haven't gone through the steps necessary to merge this results grid yet. Okay, so kind of take that fear off the table, or start in a sandbox, even better than if you do accidentally merge something. It's not as big of a deal as if you were to do it in production. Okay, so now we have our results grid. And when I come into my results grid, the first place I always look is down here in the bottom left-hand corner. It tells me how many records and how many groups were returned based on my current set of criteria. So that's a really good indicator as to whether or not this is a good scenario for you. If this number is really small, or if you get no results, then 9 times out of 10, your scenario is too rigid. And you have to do some things to loosen it up or look at different fields in order to pull in some duplicates. Okay, so now that we've got that up, I've got a screenshot of our criteria that I'm going to drag over so we can kind of see some of these mapping types and how they're working here. So I'm just going to pop this here at the bottom. And then let's go through a few of these examples. So if we look up here at some of our account names, you can see that the account names are very similar, but not exactly the same. And that's that cleaned account name mapping type working. So Masonic and Eastern Star, one has "and" spelled out, one is using the ampersand. Cleaned account knows to see the ampersand as the word "and" spelled out, so now those are seen as duplicates. Okay, this prefix "the" here is being ignored in our second group. The word incorporated versus ink in our third group here. So these are the kinds of things that this cleaned account name mapping type is looking for. When we get back to step 2 and start going through our details there, we'll be able to drill into the details or the tables that this mapping type is using, and make changes if we need to. If we need to add our own abbreviations, maybe we need manufacturing to be seen as MFG. We can add those to our account cleaning list so that it will work better for our own individual data sets. Okay, let's take a look at on our billing street field, we're using our street address match mapping type. And this is a very rigid address matching. It wants all of the same elements to be in both addresses, but there can be some variations in how certain words are expressed. So if we look at this top example here, 700 South Holden Road. South is written out in one and abbreviated in the other. That's okay. It's still able to be seen as a duplicate group. If there were any other element in one of these addresses, so if this second address had maybe a suite number or an additional PO box, then this rigid street address match would not be able to see those as duplicates. But again, when we go back, we're going to talk about how to switch out these mapping types and loosen them up a little bit to pull in more and more duplicates. Zip 5 and 9, pretty self-explanatory. If one zip has the 4-digit extension and the other one does not, that would be able to still see those as duplicates. And the numeric is just looking at the numbers in the records. Okay. So that's a basic look at a group of results. So you've kind of seen how a scenario translates into this grid of duplicate records. Now, before we go through the process of merging this, I want to take a step back and talk about how you can manipulate these scenarios and really build out that multi-pass strategy, starting rigid to loose, that will work best for your org. Okay, because these out-of-the-box scenarios are great, but a lot of times you're going to have to make some changes. Okay, so one thing I want to point out first before we go more in depth on mapping types, the scenario that we're looking at now, or the criteria that we're using now, wants data to be populated in all of the fields that we're looking at. So if we look right now at our phone number field, you can see all the way down here, there's a phone number populated on each of these records. One way that we can loosen up a scenario is to turn on a feature called Match Blank Values, which will allow Single Table Dedupe to see blank strings of data as matching data. So if you have two records that are both blank in a particular field, but you're matching on that, it would be able to see those blank strings as matches. So let's go back into our criteria, and I'll show you how to turn that on, and then we'll be able to see it in our results. All right, so we're going to go back to step 2 and really kind of go through and make some adjustments here, some tweaks to see if we can up that number of duplicates at the bottom right-hand corner. Okay, to turn on that match blank values feature, if I come over here to the left-hand side of my screen, this first column, I have the ability to turn this on for any field that I need to, okay? So we're just going to check this box on the phone number field. And when we get back to our results, we'll be able to see groups where phone number is blank on both records. All right, so that's one way to kind of loosen things up if you feel like your scenario is a little bit too rigid. You can also add additional fields here if you need to. So maybe you need to match on the website field in addition to the 5 that we are included in the pre-built. If I need to add a field, I'm going to come down to the bottom left-hand corner, choose Add Mapping Condition, and then just grab my website. Whoop, that's not right. Grab my website. All right, and then I could move on and apply a mapping type. If you want to get rid of any of these mapping types and not match on a particular field, we're going to use that same process of highlighting the row and hitting delete on our keyboard. And now we took that website mapping condition away. Okay, let's go a little bit more in depth on mapping types so you can kind of make informed decisions on what you want to use when. So mapping types are going to change depending on the rigidness of your scenario, okay? So this particular scenario is rigid, so we're using some of our more rigid mapping type options. Cleaned account name, by far most commonly used mapping type because it's very rare that 2 account names are written the same way on duplicate records, okay? If we had to do an exact match on account name, the account names would have to be the same down to the punctuation. So this cleaned account name allows for some common variations that we see when matching on account names or company names on the lead object. How it works is by referencing this account cleaning list over on the upper left-hand corner of your screen. So when we pop into here, we can see the individual tables that this mapping type is referencing. So when we looked at that Eastern Star and ampersand versus and spelled out, this is where that's represented in this account cleaning list. And we can see that the ampersand is being seen as the word and spelled out. And that's happening here in our replace tab. So on this replace tab, anytime we see a value over here on the left, it's going to be viewed as the value over here on the right. When you first install DemandTools and start using it, your default replace list is going to be everything from this red dot up. Everything below that, I have added. So if you do have common abbreviations that show up over and over again in your data, go ahead and try to remember to add them to this list so that the next time you run a job, manufacturing is seen as MFG or technology as tech, those kinds of things. Not case sensitive, so just put the long version on the left and the abbreviation on the right, and case sensitivity does not impact what is seen as matches. Okay, your suffix removal. Anytime one of these words is seen at the end of the account name, it's just going to be ignored and not analyzed. So in our grid, we had incorporated versus Inc. Both of those were at the very end of the account name, so they were scrubbed off and not analyzed. And you can add to this list as well. I think I've added in Corp group, I think I added these 4 values here at the bottom in this list. And then your last tab here, your prefix removal. Anytime one of these words is at the beginning of the account name, it's just going to be ignored and not analyzed. I think we had an example of the in that grid that was ignored because of the prefix removal tab. Okay, so highly encouraged to add some things here, make it a little bit more robust and more customized for your data. Okay, so that's cleaned account name in a nutshell, which is a really good mapping type on a rigid scenario. But you will run into times where this is too rigid and it's not seeing dupes that are in your org. So we talk about over and over again this multi-pass strategy. So on your semi-rigid scenario or on a looser scenario, you might choose to select a different mapping type for how you're going to match your account names together. One way to loosen up a scenario on account name is to use a mapping type called first XX words. So when I switch to first XX words, I'm no longer referencing my account cleaning list, okay? But now I'm just telling it, let's tell it to look at just the first 2 words in my account name field. So if I have variations that are at the end of my account name, now they're just going to be ignored. It's only going to be reading those first 2 words, whatever they may be. And if those first 2 words are the same and all the other fields I'm matching on, then it will be seen as a duplicate. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to loosen up street address. We talked about how rigid the street address mapping type is. You have another option here. So if we go to our drop down now, we're going to switch out our street address mapping type for our relaxed address match here, which gives you a little bit more wiggle room. Okay, it's going to just, and we'll see some examples, but it's just going to parse out the street number and the street name. And everything else is in that field is essentially going to be ignored when trying to match your addresses together. Okay, zip 5 and 9. I don't have you could use a numeric on billing postal code, but zip 5 and 9 is probably the loosest I'd go there. For phone number, numeric is a rigid option, just looking at the numbers in the field. But you also have a looser option here, relaxed NA phone match. Designed for North American records. There's where the NA comes from. and essentially ignores the area code and any extension information. So it's basically just a match on the 7-digit local number. So kind of use that as you see fit. I would always include some kind of other, either geographical indicator or something else to ensure that you're not matching to the wrong records when you loosen up on phone number here. Okay. Now, you have a lot of other options for mapping types. So if you're matching on website, you've got some domain matching options. On first name field, you've got a first name mapping type that references this list of nicknames here. So kind of go through that document that I sent and read through and see all of the different options that you have. A state match and a country match if you need to match on those fields and the values are not standardized. So tons of different combinations of things that you can do to loosen up or switch things up to try to pull in as many duplicates as possible. Just to the right of where we selected our mapping types, we also have 3 additional columns. And these options allow you to loosen up whatever mapping type you've selected a little bit more. Your fuzzy option allows for spelling or looks for spelling variations or spelling errors that there may be. So it's, to give you the in-depth definition, it's removing the vowels and analyzing the remaining consonants. So it's phonetically trying to determine if the words are the same. Transpose looks at the words in the field, but not the order that they're in. So if you had, let's say, Salesforce Foundation versus Foundation Salesforce, same words, different order, transpose would still see those as duplicates. And then the last one here, Alpha Clean, is looking at the letters and the numbers in the field and ignoring any other characters that might be floating around. So if you have question marks or apostrophes, those will be scrubbed off and ignored. Okay, so we've made some changes to this particular set of criteria, and those changes are going to impact the results that we see. So now when we go back into step 3 again, we will have a different grid, okay, because we're matching in different ways on a lot of fields. We're using matching on blank values, on phone number, a different mapping type on account name and street address and phone number. So we should see we've loosened up, not significantly, but enough that we should see an increased volume in that grid. So let's pop into step 3 again and kind of look at how that set of criteria translates into our grid and what our differences are. Whoops. Don't want to get rid of that. And I did. Let me add billing address back that I just deleted. Okay, there we go. All right. Daggone if I didn't do it again. Okay. Just want to get that bigger. All right, so now what's the first thing I always do in my grid? Bottom left-hand corner. Look how many more records I'm looking at now, just from those couple of changes that we made. So I think we had something like 300 accounts before, and now we have over 1,200, almost 1,300 in almost 600 groups. So just those few changes that I made significantly impacted how many records were pulled into my results grid here. And if we go up and start kind of verifying these results and dissecting what was returned, we'll be able to see these mapping types working a little bit differently than they did with our first set. Let's make that bigger so we can see. Okay, so we look here, access point. This one was brought in because of our street addresses. This is a good example of our relaxed address match working as opposed to using our street address match. So like I said, with relaxed address match, you get a little bit more wiggle room. Here, it's just parsing out the street number and the street name. And everything else is ignored. So it doesn't matter that one has a suite number and the other one doesn't. It's still able to see these as duplicates. Okay, and you see a lot of this happening in this particular grid. On our account name, we loosened this up and took it from cleaned account name to first 2 words. So we can see here now this Allen Tate Furniture versus Allen Tate Furniture Company versus Allen Tate Co. All of these are just seen as Allen Tate. And those extensions on there are ignored because we're just looking at the first two words. And we see a few other examples of that as well. When you start to loosen up your scenarios, which you will, you do want to be very mindful of the changes that you make, because you could potentially loosen up a scenario too much to where you're pulling in a significant amount of false positives or duplicates that appear to be duplicates based on our criteria. But when you really start looking at it, they are not duplicates. And let's just scroll down and spot check and make sure we don't have any of that going on here. Okay, here's a potential example of that. Right here, this group, we have Beaufort County Schools, Beaufort County Hospital. They have the same address, but we're just looking at the first two words, they're being seen as duplicates. So my gut tells me that 628 East 12th Street might be a municipal building of some sort, and these probably aren't duplicates. So I could either go back to step 2, up my XX words to 3, which would eliminate this group, or just manually make sure I unselect these from this grid. And that really is, we're getting ready to transition into our master record selection process. And you'll find that you have a combination of scenarios that are very automated in nature. So if it's rigid, you don't have to do too much verification here. You're really sure that they're duplicates. You'll select your master records and you'll move on very quickly. But on some of your looser scenarios, especially during your initial cleanup, you may have scenarios that are more manual in nature. Okay, so they're looser, and you really want to go through group by group and eyeball it and say, yes, this is a duplicate group, or no, this is not. And there's a lot of variables that come into play here. If you're a 20 million account org, you probably won't have any manual scenarios because it's just not feasible. But if you're an org with 500,000 records, it's very possible that you could have some scenarios that are more manual in nature, depending on how much grunt work you want to put into this and how much kind of help you have, manpower you have. Okay. Let's now start talking. We have a grid we like. So once you get a grid that you're happy with, now you're going to go through the process of merging your groups. In order to merge a grid, you have to have a master record selected for each group that you want to merge. Okay, and so that master record is going to be the record that lives on in Salesforce. If you've ever done any merging on accounts in the Salesforce user interface, we use that same merge call. So if you're used to that, it's going to work the same way here, just on a mass scale. So for manual selection, I'm going to show you two ways. We can do this manually, or we can automate it by using a scoring system. So we're going to manually do this first. So if I wanted to manually select my master records, I'm going to focus on this third column from the left of gray pins. And for each record that I want to be the master, I'm just going to double click on that pin, and that pin will turn to green. And that just indicates that this top record here is going to be the record that lives on in Salesforce. The red button pin is going to merge into this, known as the subordinate record. And when that merge happens, any sub-objects associated with this subordinate record will be reparented to the master. Okay, so you're not losing any of that detail there. All right, so that's what a manual job would look like. So as we're going through, if we see a group that we don't want merged, we could just leave them out or uncheck the boxes, either way. And that would be a manual way to select your master records. Now, the second way to do this is this automated way called master rules. And if we look over here in the upper left-hand corner, we see a list of master rules that we can choose from. And a master rule is essentially just a scoring system set up to weight your records, okay? So the record, based on the scoring that you set up with the highest point total, that pin will automatically turn to green. So in this class, we're primarily going to talk about the pre-built master rules that you have available. But just know that you can create your own master rules. So if your org already has a process in place that determines which record is more valuable than another based on a certain set of criteria, you're going to want to go in and create a rule to match that. Okay, and we do go more in depth on master rule creation in the advanced class on this. So for the pre-built master rules, everything in this grid from most active contracts down ships with the tool. So you have all of these available to you to start with. So let's go into our, actually I think most complete records is not. I think I created that. Let's go into most recently modified record. That's a really common one that we see people use. So we're going to go into edit rule. And we can see here, this rule really is based on the thought process that a record that was modified most recently is actively being worked and has more value than one that may be sitting out there stagnant. So in this rule, it's looking at the record as a whole. And the record that was most recently modified is going to get a score of 10. And the other records in the group would not be awarded any points. So if we wanted to run this rule on all of the records in this grid, I can just check the box here. Okay, whoops. And then I'm going to come all the way down to the bottom of my grid. And down here at the bottom, I have what we call our grid control options. So I'm going to come to this section called Current Master Rule, and I'm going to click the button Apply to All. Now, there are other options. You can apply to everything, you can apply to checked, and you can apply to unchecked. So if you wanted to use a combination of manual selection and applying a master rule, you could. So I've gone through right now and selected master records for about 6 groups. If I just wanted to apply my master rule to everything that's not checked, then I can choose my unchecked option here. But for the training purposes, we want to apply to everything. So we're going to go ahead and click this option. And it went very fast and ran that rule on now. And now every group in my grid has a master record selected. And you can see the corresponding points as well. Now, if I wanted to verify my results, I would definitely, especially if you're creating your own rule, bring in the fields that you're basing your master rule on, just to make sure that it's working the way that you want it to. So I'm going to come here to Show More Fields and pull in the last modified date. And that way I can come in here and spot check. Now, a lot of my records looks like were updated at about the same time, but Salesforce knows the exact date time of each record. Okay, so that's your master rule and how you go through executing that. Now, another option that you have that is covered in great detail in the advanced class, and there's a short video, like a 10-minute video I did recently that covers this concept as well, is this concept of field rules. So I'll give you a little hint about what this is, so if you want to explore this further, you can. The way that this scenario is set up right now, we have our master record selected. So when these records merge, all the field values from the master record here are going to be what remains in Salesforce. Unless, of course, a field is blank. And in that case, the value from the subordinate record would populate into that field on the master. If you want a higher level of control as to what field value remains in a particular field, okay, you want to choose a value other than what's on the master, that's when you can use this concept of field rules. So I'll give you a quick hint peek here. If we check this box, Use Field Rules, okay, and then I'm going to click New Rule, what I get is a pop-up that shows me all of my fields on the account object. And now I have the ability to apply a different rule to each field if I wanted to. So for this record, or for this scenario rather, my master rule is selecting the most recently modified record as the master. But maybe I have a need to have the billing information to be retained from the oldest record. So I can go to my billing fields here, and instead of choosing the rule master, I can tell it to keep the billing street from the oldest record. Okay, so it just allows you to automate the customization of what field is selected or kept when this merge executes. Okay, so field rules, anytime you have a need or a desire to keep a field value other than what's on the master, that's when you're going to go and see if there's a field rule that would meet your needs and work in that situation. Okay. All right, we're getting ready to merge this grid. A couple of more little details about this grid before we do that. I know there's a ton of information here. This next section is fairly important, combined field values. This is available on your text area, true false, and multi-select pick list fields, and you can see that here. Okay, so you don't have to memorize that. If for any of these fields you want Salesforce to keep both values when the merge executes, then you can select the desired field that you want that to happen for down here. So for account description, when I merge, if I want to keep the account descriptions from both records and concatenate those values together in that field, combined field values allows me to do that. Okay, moving on. The last thing we'll cover is down here towards the bottom, you can determine what happens to the non-master or the subordinate record when this merge executes. The default and the best practice is for that record to be deleted, okay, and go to the recycle bin. But you'll see you do have a prefix option, which will keep that record in the org with the prefix value. Most of the time, the word delete is what's used, so that if you accidentally merge or you want to undo something, you'll still have that record up and available in your org. And then the last thing here before we merge is you do have some notification options to kind of keep track of what's being merged by DemandTools. So you can choose to create a task, a summary task, a summary email, and that will go to the user who's executing the merge. So in that case, it would be me. Or you can create a task per merge. So for each individual group that you can send to either yourself or to the master record owner. Okay, be cautious if you're doing a ton. You know, you wouldn't want somebody to get 50 tasks letting them know that a bunch of stuff has been merged. But anyway, use that kind of as you see fit. All right, so we're going to go now and merge this grid. And once we get done merging, then we will go back and take a quick look at contacts. So if you have any questions on your mind about what we've talked about in terms of accounts so far, go ahead and be thinking about typing those out before we kind of switch gears here and really start to wrap things up. All right, so let's merge a few records in this grid. We won't do everything. Let's come here to uncheck all down here in my grid control. And I'm just going to merge a few groups here. Let me merge some that I'm not too attached to. I get attached to some of my test data. And another neat little trick, these little icons here, I think it's binoculars, just to the left of your first column, allows you to open these records up in Salesforce. So if you're testing, definitely open these up. So I get to see this record. I could open the other one, execute my merge on just that one group, and just make sure everything ended out the way that it should. Sub-objects all got reparented. If you're using field rules, make sure the right field value remained. And that just helps without having to go and search for these two records to make sure that you find the right ones. It's just the easier way to get there. All right, so I think we've got 2 or 3 groups. We're going to go ahead and choose Merge Check Records now. And when I click this, let's watch this closely, I'm always going to get this pop-up that reminds me that I don't get a restore file for merging, okay? And we're using the Salesforce merge code, and unfortunately, that does not provide us with restore information. So Make sure that you've done some testing. You're absolutely certain you want these particular records to merge before you move forward and execute. To bring things back, you have to go in and undelete them manually from the recycle bin or use any backup data that you might have. So we do recommend testing in a sandbox first, and you can always use DemandTools with your sandbox as part of your license. So we're going to click yes. And now we'll kind of walk through and see that execute. Typically, the rule of thumb is it takes about 3 to 5 seconds per group to merge, give or take, depending on how many people are using the API at any given time, how much traffic there is, so to speak. And then when that executes, you're going to get this pop-up. And make sure not to close this out too quickly because this second row here is going to tell you if anything went wrong during that job. Okay, so you want to make sure that you didn't have any errors here. If you did have errors that were thrown from a dedupe job, they're going to be written here in this log file. And your log file is just a running log of everything you've done in DemandTools on a given day. So we'll pop this open and we can see I haven't done much today, and here are those records that were just merged, so I get that information. Luckily, we didn't have any errors that time. If you do get an error, a lot of our common errors are documented on our community, on the forum, so definitely search there or open a case if you have questions as to what's going on with that file. Okay, and when I hit OK, I'm done. And I'm ready to move on to my next scenario. Always remember too, when you create a scenario that you like and you know you're going to use again, make sure to save it. So, right, I like this scenario. It worked pretty well for us. So we're going to come down here to the bottom left-hand corner, and I'm going to choose Save Scenario. And I can save it anywhere on my PC that I want to. I like to save mine in my scenarios folder within DemandTools data, because when I do that, it's going to show up in that tree on step 1. So let's call this, this is the first training of 2018. So we'll call this our 2018 rigid, semi-rigid account dedupe. And click Save. It creates my overview for me. And now when I go back to step 1, and going too fast, sorry guys, and pop open my account folder here, look, there it is, right at the top for me to use again. Okay, so that was accounts. Now, we spent a lot of time on accounts, but that's okay, because once you've learned this process for one object, it is pretty much the same for all of your other objects. Now, you're going to be matching on different fields when you move into an object like contacts or any of your custom objects. But this thought process of determining the field you want to match on and the mapping types you want to use and kind of going back and forth and trying different things is going to be the same regardless of the object that you're working with. So let's go now and just take a quick peek at contacts just for fun, because you do have something that you can do in DemandTools when you're deduping that you can't do in Salesforce. So let's switch out here. I'll actually just clear this scenario out altogether. And we'll go down to and look at our contact scenarios. And when you're deduping contacts with DemandTools or Single Table Dedupe, you have the ability to dedupe contacts within an account, which is what you can do in Salesforce. So if I look at my pre-built scenarios here, within an account is taking into consideration the account ID that the record is associated with. But in DemandTools, I can also dedupe contacts that are between accounts that may not be associated with the same account ID. So if we look up here at our between account scenarios, we can see that the criteria does not include any account information. So that's a need of some of our customers. They need to be able to dedupe contacts that are not associated to the same account. And this provides you the way to do that. But other than that, really everything else is largely the same. So if we go ahead and just load up this contacts rigid scenario here, okay, everything, it's got my list of fields that I want to see in my grid here. I'm going to come down here to the bottom and choose use conditions and tell it, let's dedupe contacts that I own. So I'm just going to say owner alias equals Ashley. I do have a new tab that appeared. Did anybody notice my new tab right here? So if you are using Salesforce duplicate management and you have pre-identified or duplicates that were identified by those rules, then you can build a grid of that data too. Okay, and again, that's covered in the other class, but I'll give you a little sneak peek. So here I have a Salesforce dupe management rule set up on email only. And there are 300 duplicate sets based on that rule. So I can just essentially build a grid of that data. So duplicates that have already been identified from duplicate management, and now I have a way to merge those a lot faster than going one by one. Anyway, sidetrack. The only other difference when we're talking about objects like leads and contacts is you're going to be focusing more on the person's information as opposed to that basic account information. So this is where that first name mapping type might come into play. All right. So we've got here first name, last name, email, phone, street, and our corresponding mapping types. The first name mapping type references this nickname list. So kind of like our account cleaning list, just for names. So long versions of names and their nicknames here. And it's pretty comprehensive. There's like over 800 values here, but you can add to, if you scroll all the way down, you can add to this list as well. Okay, but outside of that, when we get to our grid, all of our other options are the same. We can manually select masters. We can choose a master rule, whatever our needs might be. We can even use field rules here. Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about before we end this or wrap this up is saving scenarios between users. So if you have multiple users at your org and you want everybody to be using the same list of deduplication scenarios, we're going to come up to the top toolbar here and go to Edit and then Options. And the center tab here, File Paths. If you've not found this area of options yet, this is where all of your important DemandTools documents live on your PC. Okay, so you have your restore files, not for dedupe, but for your maintenance modules. Your log files are here. You can point these to any location that you want to. So right now, they're on your local PC in My Documents, DemandTools data. So for your single table dedupe scenarios, you can point this file path to a shared drive that everyone on your team has access to. And so that way, your scenario tree that we talked about will populate from this location as opposed to the standard DemandTools data in your My Documents. So if person A creates 5 scenarios and they want everyone to be able to access those, if everybody's pointed to the same folder, you would have that option. Kind of along that same line, those same lines, if you made changes to your account cleaning list, where we added manufacturing and MFG, if you want everyone to be using the same account cleaning list, this bottom replace list directory here, you'll want to point that to the same location, and that's where that particular file lives. Okay, so that's that. I'm going to leave us with, I'm going to open up the forum. If you've not been here yet, definitely check it out. crmfusion.com, community. Things like scenario sharing are on here. I've got that video on, I'll pull that up, on field rules. Don't know where I put it, is here. So check out the forum, lots of commonly asked questions, those types of things. And then last thing, and if you have questions, I'll hang out for a few minutes if you have a question. But if not, feel free to drop off. And if you're already loving DemandTools, we definitely encourage you to go out to the App Exchange and write a review for us, trying to get some new reviews in the new year. And I appreciate everybody's time today. First training of 2018. You can say you were here. All right, that's all I have. I'll be here for questions. Thanks so much. And I think, let's see what we have on tap for tomorrow. I know there's a training tomorrow. We'll see. Oh, a DemandTools overview. That's a new class, first time tomorrow. We're just going to be doing a quick overview of all the modules. So if you're trying to know what all you have when you purchase DemandTools, it's just a quick 30-minute rundown of everything you have access to. Kind of can help with your training, planning your training schedule. Okay, that's it. I'm done. Thanks so much. I appreciate you guys. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate it. Okay, unchecking the Salesforce dedupe box, Salesforce merge in the step 3 is going to not use the Salesforce merge call. So you want to keep that checked so that all of your sub-objects are reparented as they should be. In some of the non-standard and custom objects, that's not available. So when it's available, we encourage you to always keep that checked. So we really don't want you to uncheck that. If you do uncheck it, there are some caveats that are applied, and we go through that in the advanced class. But if you go back to that screen and uncheck it, there is a document that pops up, and you can kind of read through what happens. But just some things are going to execute much differently and typically not in a positive manner when you don't use the Salesforce merge call.